What happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? Well, the Revolutionary War is what happens, actually. And last time, we seen kind of glimpses of that. A standoff between the British and colonial legislatures over the issue of direct taxation. Remember, there's a battle cry over no taxation without representation as the British start levying direct taxes against their American colonies. From the British perspective, it's totally reasonable, right? Because they're paying off this enormous war debt that they accrued to protect the American colonies from the hated French. And certainly the American colonies should pay their fair share, right? From the American perspective, and we can actually start using the term the American perspective up to a point, that is illegitimate because the people being taxed in the colonies aren't represented in the British Parliament. It's not people from Massachusetts and Virginia who are voting for those taxes. It's people from Birmingham and Glasgow and, basically everywhere not America, which is part of the problem. We also talked about the standoff over the Stamp Act and how ridiculous of an idea it was, where basically everybody who's literate and educated has an incentive to challenge the British over this issue of taxation without representation. So eventually the British repeal the Stamp Act quietly, and the Americans are kind of patting themselves on the back, thinking that the mission accomplished. And to top it all off, things get so bad that the British Prime Minister, the most powerful politician in the British Empire, is forced to resign, the Earl of Rockingham. But remember that Parliament also passes the Declaratory Act, an act which basically says that all taxes from Parliament are considered to be legitimate. And that kind of escapes the notice of some of the colonies or some of the colonists, because you're like, yeah, sure, you're just trying to save face because, you had to concede. And so it's just all a bunch of puffery. It's all a bunch of smack talk. So in looking ahead, the Earl of Rockingham has resigned. And interestingly, the person who takes his place is an individual by the name of William Pitt. If that name sounds familiar, it should, because remember, William Pitt is the prime minister that made the French and Indian War not just another colonial skirmish, but a war for the colonies themselves, a war for almost all of North America. And remember that, because of this, William Pitt has some serious street cred in the American colonies. To some extent, what's going on between the American colonists and the British Parliament is more of like a partisan debate. Rockingham and some of his supporters, they don't get us. But William Pitt, he gets us. He understands what we're going through. And to be honest, William Pitt does. William Pitt, throughout his career, will express great sympathy for the American colonist. But that doesn't change a basic fact. And the basic fact is that Britain is up to its elbows in debt because of the French and Indian War. And that debt has to be paid off somewhere. You can raise taxes in Britain. And again, the British people are already heavily taxed, the most taxed people in Europe, generally speaking. Or you could try to raise that money elsewhere. And even William Pitt's government chooses answer choice B, the answer choice that doesn't involve raising taxes in Great Britain. It's also worth kind of mentioning that at this point in his career, William Pitt is kind of a more hands-off prime minister, and a lot of power is wielded by his treasury secretary. In Britain, they call the person who occupies that position the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and that person is usually a person who wields enormous power in British politics, usually second only to the Prime Minister. Charles Townshend passes a series of 5 acts, or proposes a series of 5 acts that are passed by Parliament that are collectively known as the Townshend Acts. These are taxes on imports to the American colonies like tea, glass, lead, etc. Now, if this should sound kind of familiar, it's because it should. Remember that these taxes on imports, have been tried before. And one thing to kind of realize here is that some of these parliamentary acts kind of sound repetitive. At least that's what you might think. And you know what? You're right. They are repetitive. And that is exactly the point. They're repetitive because the British keep going back to this old idea of trying to tax the colonies through trade, basically, taxing things that are being sent to the colonies. And so what's kind of happening is that in reaction to the Townshend Acts, the colonists feel kind of demoralized because everybody was sort of hoping that William Pitt would kind of come in and save the day, right? Because he loves the American colonies, he understands how important they are, and even in the best case scenario, in a British government led by William Pitt, you still get basically a repetition of these same old taxes, right? And so what kind of happens is that, up until this point, you could kind of argue that the division between colonial legislatures and colonists in general in the British Parliament is more of like a partisan debate, like partisan debates between Republicans and Democrats. But this kind of escalates matters. And I should go ahead and sort of discuss a little bit of how political parties work in this time period, because it is going to be relevant to understand how politics work in basically the American colonies during the Revolutionary War time period. You've probably heard of the Whigs and the Tories. And those labels are used to describe individuals who are either loyal to the British government or individuals who are loyal to the idea of an independent American nation, or who are at least, let's say, dissenters against the British government. Now, these labels actually refer to political parties in Great Britain, and they're really not parties in the way we think about them. So Tories and Whigs are less organized political parties and more like cliques or groups of friends who kind of, share some similar interests and passions. But if you have to sort of generalize who the Tories are and who the Whigs are, being a Tory is being the party of the king, of English high culture, of the nobility, and the Church of England. The Tories were the supporters of King Charles during the English Civil War. They're usually supporters of an Anglican church that is that adopts a liturgy or a way of worship that seems similar to the Catholic Church. And so they're also the party of, let's say, a stronger monarchy and a stronger centralized government, right? Where the government is probably, if you think about the social contract between the people and the government, the Tories, at least at this point, kind of think that the government should have a lot more power and specifically a lot more bargaining power than the people in that social contract. The Whigs, on the other hand, are the party of the middle class. It's the party of the small farmers in the countryside. It's the party of the merchant class. It's the party of, to a certain extent, the Puritans, or at least people who want to sort of lean away from, an ornate Anglican church that seems kind of Catholic in worship. And it's also a term that we kind of associate with the parliamentary forces during the English Civil War, the group of people who wanted to constrain the power of the king. So the simplistic view, if you're an American colonist who's not all that happy about the Stamp Act or direct taxation, is that the Whigs are the good guys and the Tories are the bad guys. But that simple outlook did not survive the passage of the Townshend Acts, because what colonial Americans learned is that functionally, there's no difference between a British Tory and a British Whig. They pass the same policies and the same taxes. The Whigs might act a little nicer, but it's a passive-aggressive kind of niceness, apparently. So the lesson learned is that this is no longer a debate between British Whigs and British Tories. Instead, this is a debate between American colonists and the British Parliament. So increasingly what you're going to see is that when Americans use the term Whig, they're not really talking so much about wanting to, let's say, be proud members of the British Whig Party. The Whigs are seen to be a party that sort of defies authority, that defies authoritarian control. And so when Americans talk about them being themselves as Whigs, they're kind of advertising the fact that they are challenging a parliament that's seen as too authoritarian. Now, on the other hand, if you're a Tory, increasingly, that advertises the fact that you are a loyalist to the Crown and to the British government in general. Now, that being said, we're still a long way from people actually wanting to separate with the British Empire, even at this point. But we do have to look at the reaction to the Townshend Acts. There's a couple of points. One is the fact that this is one of those things that causes more moderate individuals to start thinking about more radical action. So, for example, John Dickinson is seen as a centrist in Pennsylvania, somebody who's reasonable, whose political outlook is pretty moderate, and he's a Quaker. And remember, Quakers are supposed to sort of embrace nonviolence and in all forms, right? So Dickinson writes a series of essays called Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania. By the way, Dickinson is no ordinary farmer, right? He's only one of the most powerful people in Pennsylvania other than Franklin. But listen to this excerpt, and I guess I'll try to do my best Dickinson impersonation. If at length it becomes undoubted that an inveterate resolution is formed to annihilate the liberties of the governed, the English history affords frequent examples of resistance by force. What particular circumstances will, in any future case, justify such resistance can never be ascertained till they happen. Dun dun dun. Okay, he didn't actually say that. Perhaps it may be allowable to say generally that it never can be justifiable until the people are fully convinced that any further submission will be destructive to their happiness. So, the last part doesn't sound too bad. In other words, the people have to buy into, the idea that resistance is okay. But here is a moderate, reasonable, elite member of the legislature of Pennsylvania actually talking about resistance by force. He says the English history affords frequent examples of resistance by force. That's not just Dickinson trying to, be a history teacher. He's not just trying to say, oh, it's of trivial importance, but by the way, have you ever heard about Magna Carta? Have you ever heard about the English Civil War? He's bringing those examples up because in his mind, the American colonies is just, or what's going on in the American colonies is just a continuation of that broader trend in British history. The challenge of the little guy against centralized government authority. You might remember, by the way, when we talked about the history of how there's this idea of Whig history. The idea that history is all about the triumph of progress, of the little guy against mean people and bullies. And actually, this is kind of where that term comes from, that English history and history in general is the story of the ascension of the individual over strong autocratic government. And it's interesting to note that even at this point, things are not really good between the British Parliament and the American colonies, but many of these colonists see their struggle as just a continuation of British history, not, a separation with that history. But what also happens is that to enforce these acts, we see those writs of assistance, those things that everybody is so happy about, right? These super search warrants that give the British Navy the opportunity to search any ship that it wants to at leisure. And I talked about them a little bit beforehand, but this is where those writs of assistance become really controversial. We saw this with the Sugar Act, and now you see it again with the Townshend Acts. So this is also when the Liberty incident occurs, where basically a ship is impounded, and John Hancock is tried for violating these Townshend Acts because he smuggles, in Hancock's case, he was smuggling wine. But again, what eventually happens is that the Liberty is marooned off the coast of Rhode Island, and an angry mob forms and burns the ship. Also, by the way, there is another British revenue ship, the Gaspee, which we'll talk about again in just a second, but it seems more appropriate to bring it up now, that also is charged with inspecting ships and basically taking possession of smuggled cargo. It also runs aground in Rhode Island. An angry mob forms, and you guessed it, it's burned to the ground. So if you have to maroon yourself somewhere, don't make it be Rhode Island. Just avoid Rhode Island. You'll be a lot happier. Anyway, but something that also happens that a lot of people have probably already heard about is the Boston Massacre in 1770. Cliff Notes version of the Boston Massacre. British troops open fire on an unarmed crowd of protesters who are basically voicing their many grievances against tyrannical British authority. And this is a key moment in which the American colonies realize that they're better off without Britain. No, it doesn't. Or no, it isn't. So the reality is that the story of the Boston Massacre is a whole lot more complex, and it is significant, but not really for the reasons that you might suspect. So a little bit of context. Remember that Massachusetts and Great Britain have a super awkward relationship. Massachusetts is, I think last time I compared the British colonies to, kids in a large family, and Great Britain to mom/dad. So Virginia is the child that is kind of like the child that always wants to act like mom. Right? They're a carbon copy of mom. Massachusetts is the child that ran away at the age of 13 and made their own way in the world. And there's a lot of baggage between Massachusetts and Great Britain. And that baggage doesn't stop with the establishment of Plymouth in 1620. Remember that in the 1680s, the British basically cancel the colony of Massachusetts Bay and absorb it into this super colony called the Dominion of New England. And Massachusetts wasn't about that. Remember that they actually rise up in rebellion in, I think, 1690 in Boston. So the idea that Bostonians are cranky or were cranky at the British is kind of like saying, and the weather is sunny. It's something that's kind of obvious and can be taken for granted. But there are a couple of other unique things going on here. Remember, the British stationed a large army in the American colonies, ostensibly to protect the colonies from a Native American attack, like you saw with Pontiac's War. Now, these troops were in many cases stationed in the homes of Bostonians, and also these troops would kind of annoy Bostonians by challenging them when they were just moving through the street, saying, "Who goes there?" And you'd have to kind of identify yourself and what you were doing. And this seemed very heavy-handed to New Englanders. And it sort of evoked memories of, the Star-Chambered Court and the fact that the British, the whole reason that Massachusetts was founded was a response to British heavy-handedness, right? So that's problem one. Problem two is that many of the British soldiers were not particularly well paid, which is kind of something that is a fixture in the history of the British Army. And so, if you were an enterprising British soldier and you wanted to make a little bit more money, you would, in your off-duty hours, go to work with a local merchant or tradesman. And the thing is because you were paid so little in your normal job, and because at least the British Army would kind of provide things like food, lodging, etc., you didn't have to be paid as much as ordinary Bostonians. So you could ask for lower wages and ensure that you were always going to be hired over local workers. So there's a lot of resentment, actually, between, let's say, the lower classes in Boston and the British Army, because not really because of heavy-handed tactics exactly, but because of wage competition. So what happens is let me make sure I get the date right. I'm not even sure if I put an exact date here. I don't. That's fine. What happens is that one night in 1770, there is a lone British sentry by the name of Hugh Montgomery. Hugh Montgomery is, like most British Army troops, pretty young. And it's also worth noting in the American Revolution that it wasn't uncommon to see young kids, not too young kids, but people y'all's age, serve in regiments. So Montgomery was apparently confronted by a bunch of kids who sort of made fun of him. And at first, it's a sticks and stones can break my bones, right? But words can never hurt me, until those words do become sticks and stones, or at least snowballs. And Montgomery is scared. And so what happens is that Montgomery gets help from the rest of his unit. Led by a guy by the name of Captain Prescott. So Captain Prescott and his unit comes out, and of course what also happens is that there's kind of a feedback loop where the more people who come out to see what's going on, the more people join. And so that now there's a mob of hundreds of people, including members of the Sons of Liberty. And you know that the Sons of Liberty never cause trouble, and they always act responsibly and reasonably, right? Sarcasm, by the way. I mean, this is like one of those things that they love to be a part of, these sort of direct confrontations. And so what happens is that eventually the crowd starts taunting these British soldiers to fire. They don't, actually. But apparently what happens is that at some point, one of the members of the crowd brandishes a club and hits one of the British soldiers. And at this point, it's not really clear what happens, but what is clear is that shots are fired. And when the dust settles, I think at least five people have been shot, including, by the way, an African-American by the name of Crispus Attucks, who in the civics version of U.S. history is the first person to die in the cause of American independence. You don't want to take that away from somebody, but at the very least, John Adams wasn't so sure. John Adams, who is our second president, obviously, is also somebody with the reputation of being the best lawyer in Massachusetts. And the thing is that when these British soldiers fire upon the crowd, they're actually charged with murder, or at least manslaughter. And by the way, manslaughter in a Massachusetts court. As you might understand or reason out, there weren't too many lawyers in Massachusetts who were interested in taking up the case, but John Adams was. And John Adams was interested in taking up the case because even though he had documented reservations about direct taxation, he kind of empathized with some of the arguments raised by Whigs. He didn't think that this was the right way of airing out those grievances. This was messy. This was chaos. People died. Um, and what's also super awkward is that the leader of the Sons of Liberty in Massachusetts, Samuel Adams, was a cousin of John Adams. But even though they shared some of the same political ideas, they also disagreed about how best to achieve those ideas. And so John Adams takes the case and argues in front of a jury composed of Bostonians that these British Army soldiers were only acting in self-defense. And in yet another amazing trial in American history, John Adams does the impossible. He convinces this jury of Bostonians that these British troops were well within their rights to defend themselves. So what does that really show us? It shows us that there's a lot of resentment between Bostonians and the British. It shows us how powerful the Sons of Liberty can be, but it also shows that not everybody buys it, including individuals who were later associated with, they were later categorized as founding fathers. John Adams, at this point, is willing to go to court and defend the actions of British soldiers shooting the citizens of Massachusetts. Why? Because he thought it was a pretty clear-cut case of right and wrong, right? It doesn't matter how bad the Townshend Acts are. It doesn't justify forming an angry mob and intimidating and assaulting British troops. So it says that even in 1770, there's still a lot of work that has to be done to convince people like Adams that separation with Britain is not just a good idea, but the only idea. So now it's 1770. We're just 5 years away from the Revolutionary War. So do you know what people do? That's right. They move on with their lives. Because one thing we have to remember is that in 1860 and 1938, well, maybe not so much 1938, but in 1770, 1773, around, years that precede big wars, it's not necessarily the case that people know what's coming. Right? They just kind of go on with their lives, and that's kind of the case with the aftermath of the Townshend Acts, because what happens is that the Townshend Acts are modified. And of course, using the term modified allows the British to say that we're not repealing them, we're simply altering them. But the fact is that the taxes on most imports are dropped. So this is yet another victory for the colonists, right? Because you've demonstrated through non-importation agreements, public resistance, and all that, that these taxes are, difficult to enforce, and even if they are enforceable, they're just going to cause a lot of resentment. So what happens is that, slowly but surely, the Townshend Acts are modified so that there's only a tax that remains on tea. Dun, dun, dun. So remember, the British win the 7 Years' War, also known as the French and Indian War, and they win it so well that quite by accident they managed to take control of almost all of Canada and India. In the case of India, the British rule India through the last of the really big joint stock companies, the British East India Company, where basically the British don't directly rule India. They don't really directly rule India until 1857, but instead what happens is that you have a British corporation that really administers India. But there's a problem, and the problem is that just like every other joint stock company we talked about, the East India Company eventually declares bankruptcy. Unlike the other scenarios we've talked about, the British government decides to bail out the British East India Company and not take it over directly by appointing a royal governor, because India is apparently just far too expensive for the British government to directly administer. But the question is, this is even more debt that the British have to accrue if you're going to bail out the East India Company. So how do you pay it off? Well, one of the things that India produced in quite large quantities was tea leaves. Now, tea at this point was kind of a luxury item. Think of it as like the avocado of the 18th century. Drinking tea wasn't just posh because you extend your pinky finger out when you drink tea. The very act of drinking tea itself demonstrated that you belong to a high social class. And if, and by the way, the British would look favorably upon doing what you probably did when you first tried coffee and tea, and that is if you, it would also be seen as really posh if you just douse it in a bunch of sugar to demonstrate that wealth, right? What the British government, led by Prime Minister Lord North, decides to do is to help make bank by opening up marketplaces in the American colonies to buy tea. Tea is still going to be taxed, but because suddenly the British government finds itself in possession of all this cheap tea from India, the idea is that on the one hand, the British will be able to tax tea, so they'll get some money, some revenue. And on the other hand, these British colonists will be able to buy a luxury item on the cheap. It's a win-win for everybody, right? And we talked about the fact that colonial elites liked to demonstrate their Englishness as a way of kind of demonstrating that they had made it in the colonies. But by this point, it's too little too late. The trust that had existed between the mother country and the colonies has eroded, at least if you asked radical groups like the Sons of Liberty. So, in 1773, the Sons of Liberty tries yet again to make a demonstration against these direct taxes on the American colonies. And so, as you're probably already familiar with, members of the Sons of Liberty dress up as Native Americans, board British tea ships in Boston Harbor, and promptly throw the tea overboard. Now, the traditional view is to see the Boston Tea Party as one of those America moments, right? This time where we're asserting our independence and, just really sticking it to the man, right? When in reality, most people at the time viewed it more like this or this, just like some stupid college fraternity prank, because that's really what it was. And if you don't believe me, all you have to do is just read George Washington. He referred to Bostonians as mad, as crazy. Even a lot of the founders themselves just had very little tolerance for this kind of petty vandalism. So at this point, you might be wondering, why even talk about the Boston Tea Party, right? Well, it's the law of unintended consequences. This is one of those things that pays off for the Sons of Liberty more than they could possibly imagine. Because remember how I said that reasonable people can only be pushed so far and then they explode. Well, get ready for the explosion. The British Parliament passes a series of acts that have become better known as the coercive or the intolerable acts. I guess you can kind of get a sense of what they do based upon the title. They are coercive. They coerce people. And by the way, the people of Massachusetts found them quite intolerable. And it's easy to see why. So, point one, Boston Harbor is closed. Now, also remember that at this point in time, the economy of Massachusetts revolved around trade. 1/3 of all ships in the British Merchant Marine were built in Massachusetts. Massachusetts' destiny relies upon the sea. Remember the big fish, the sacred cod in the Massachusetts General Court. Yeah, that Massachusetts, Boston Harbor, the heart of the economy of Massachusetts, is going to be closed. And it's going to be closed until the people of Boston pay for the damage that was done. Apparently, the Sons of Liberty destroy over 18 million tea bags, which equals roughly $1 million in value in today's terms. So it's not a small amount of money. And for the British, it's now the principle of the thing. They can maybe negotiate with arguments around representation. They can kind of understand where the colonists are coming from there a little bit. They might not agree, but they can understand. This, however, this is the equivalent of negotiating with terrorists, or at least vandals, right? So, Boston Harbor will be closed until the colonists can pay it off. And keep in mind, the Sons of Liberty are a small group. We're not talking about a group of tens of thousands of people. This is a small group of agitators. And so what's happened is something like this. Does anybody remember a time where somebody messes up, somebody violates the rules, and everybody, the whole class gets punished? Yeah, that was always my favorite elementary school experience too. Everybody loves collective punishment, um, and you can kind of get a sense of how the people of Boston are feeling and thinking. Sure, this is stupid, the destruction of all this tea, but punish the people responsible. We didn't do it, because of course the British don't really buy the argument that it was really just Native Americans who did it. So that's point one, and that would be bad enough. But it gets worse. The British, by law, decide to dissolve the colonial legislature of Massachusetts, the General Court. So, in other words, this legislature that has existed practically since the foundation of Massachusetts itself is banned. And why is it banned? Well, because it's not a real legislature anyway. Now, the question is, isn't this at some point a violation of British law to do this, to basically close down assemblies, prevent people from assembling? Surely there's a law for that, right? And we mentioned that in the British political system, remember, you do have due process rights. You have Magna Carta. You have, you have the Glorious Revolution. You do have these moments and events and laws passed in British history that enshrine the rights of individuals. But here's something very important to remember about the British Constitution. You're like, Mr. Dry, why are you doing weird air quotes? Stop that. That's weird. The reason is that Britain's definition of a constitution is very different than our definition of a constitution. And it's critical that you realize that here. So in Britain, the Constitution is everything. It's every act passed by Parliament, things like the Magna Carta, the Bill of Rights passed after the Glorious Revolution, major court cases, or at least decisions in major court cases, and in some cases, it's things like tradition, how Parliament is opened, and the ceremony behind it. The Constitution is really everything. And what you have to ask yourself, and this is kind of like one of those the Matrix, there is no spoon moments. If the Constitution is everything, then isn't the Constitution nothing? Because the Constitution, at least in the way we use it, if we say that something is unconstitutional, that is a big deal, because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land. So you know that if you pit the U.S. Constitution against state law or federal law or acts that are passed by Congress, you know that the Constitution can basically beat up all that unless you actually amend the thing. But in Britain, the Constitution isn't the supreme law, it's just the law. All law is kind of equal. And so if you're closing Boston Harbor without due process, if you're closing down the colonial legislature, sure, that could technically be unconstitutional. But, oh wait, that's right. These are acts passed by Parliament. So the British have just altered their constitution. So problem solved, right? So part of why our Constitution is structured the way it is in reaction to what you see here. It's not that the British don't have a Constitution. It's just that they have a very different definition of what the Constitution is. And so when the British say, you know what, no taxation without representation, well, the British can turn around, when the American colonists say no taxation without representation, the British can turn around and say, yeah, we can, because Parliament said we could. And Parliament is the supreme law of the land, and what Parliament does is considered constitutional. And so this is a critical difference that will eventually lead to how our Constitution is kind of structured, where we have, whereas the British Constitution is everything, if you actually look at the U.S. Constitution, it is very short. And that's by design, because we want our Constitution to be, like, I know that probably you guys have to groan about having to read it in civics or something, but compared to the U.S. Federal Code, which is like novelesque, the Constitution is really short. And there's a reason for that, because the founders got a sense that the more you put in the Constitution, the less significant any of it is. What do you put in the Constitution? The way government is supposed to work. And if you think about the Bill of Rights, which later becomes part of the Constitution, think about how much gets done in a very short amount of prose. In the First Amendment, the founders guaranteed the right to freedom of speech, press, assembly, and religion. And also, not just religion, freedom to practice religion and freedom from a government establishment of religion. I mean, the First Amendment gets so much done in a very short amount of prose. I mean, it's actually really impressive. And that reflects the general sense that the founders had, that all this right here is wrong, not just because of the acts themselves, but also because of how the British constitutional system of government works. So, also along with this is that you might be asking, well, if the legislature of Boston is closed, if there is no more general court, who's actually running the colony? Well, the royal governor. And actually, we have a new royal governor now. It's no longer, a royal appointee like Thomas Hutchinson. Usually, remember, these royal governors are, kind of, I don't know, BFFs of the king and royal family. Instead, though, you have a different kind of royal governor. This is Thomas Gage. Thomas Gage is from Massachusetts, but he has a very unique backstory. He's a Massachusettsian who joins the British Army and becomes a general. And he is appointed royal governor. In other words, what is kind of going on is that Boston is kind of placed under direct military rule. And remember that the British and the American colonies kind of have a lot of baggage left over from the English Civil War. And so from their perspective, from the perspective of the people of Boston, this is the culmination of everything they've worried about and feared for practically the last couple of centuries at this point. It got pretty close to this with the creation of the Dominion of New England, but it never quite came to this point. And by the way, what they were also really upset about is the fact that religious liberty is given to French Catholics in Canada. So apparently, remember that the people of Massachusetts characterize the city of Louisburg as the stronghold of Satan, because apparently Satanism equals Catholicism. So again, we're back to that. I mean, when things can't suck anymore, then this happens, according to the people of Boston. So the people of Massachusetts don't exactly take this lying down. I mean, they just shut down the general court in Boston. There's nothing that says that they can't reconvene elsewhere. And so most of the Massachusetts general court reconvenes in Suffolk. And what they do is they immediately pass a series of acts in defiance of the coercive acts. The first is basically say the coercive acts are unconstitutional. It's kind of their way of going, you. Now, also ominously, it advises people to arm. And this is also, by the way, the beginning of the Minutemen. I should kind of say that in American military history, there is this mythology of the brave and dedicated militia soldier. Like, that the United States military is composed of citizen soldiers who are fighting to defend their homes. I gotta tell you that the more you actually look into that mythology, the more difficult it is to maintain that belief. Generally, militia organizations are they're pretty bad, actually. Usually they won't stand and fight. And generally, if militia units fight well, they're the exception that proves the rule. But the Minutemen of Massachusetts are different. They are basically organized so that they can arm and deploy in less than a minute's time. So in other words, they take militia duty seriously. And you get the sense that, once people start moving to grab guns and defend themselves, you can kind of get a sense that things are kind of going downhill from here. And also, by the way, it encourages the people of Massachusetts and beyond to once again impose those economic sanctions and non-importation agreements against Great Britain. And this is where we get to the beginning of the war. So, the fact that this happened was shocking, not just to the people of Massachusetts, but to the colonies in general. Because if the British can do this in Massachusetts, if they can say to, other than the House of Burgesses, the Massachusetts General Court was the oldest legislature in the 13 colonies. And if they can ban the legislature in Massachusetts, what else can the British do? And probably the answer is there's nothing they can't do, because the argument is that Parliament is supreme. So, in response to all this, the colonies began gathering an assembly of delegates to meet in Philadelphia to kind of hammer things out and kind of respond to this. This gathering is called the First Continental Congress. Now, this Congress, you didn't exactly run for this office, all right? You didn't have national elections to join this Congress, but these were individuals who were typically the best and most renowned members of their state legislatures. So, in other words, they're kind of the cream of the crop. And the idea is that if you appoint the best members of the legislature to represent your state, you can try to find a unified response. And remember, we've seen this before with the Stamp Act Congress. And so far, it looks like more of this. So they have two things to figure out. One, they need to figure out what liberties they have as English subjects and what rights Parliament has over them. And also they need to figure out what is going to be their response to the coercive acts. The General Court of Massachusetts, or what's left of it, they've decided to take matters into their own hands and ask people to arm. Is that going to be the response of all the colonies? Don't know. There's not a lot of great options here, because if they act too weak, and don't send a strong response, the British are just going to ignore them. But if they come on too strong, that might start, making events spiral out of control. So we've seen a lot of radical changes. We've seen the passage of the Coercive Acts. We've seen the fact that my background has changed. But for all of those changes, there's a lot that's remained remarkably consistent. At the end of the day, the delegates of the First Continental Congress are still not really thinking of war. You might have a small group of radicals, mostly from New England, who are thinking in those terms, but by and large, the rest of the colonies are still hoping to see the Coercive Acts repealed. And they're hoping to see the Coercive Acts repealed by making a direct appeal to Parliament and arguing based upon British constitutional and common law principles. They're hoping that Parliament and the British government more generally will see reason. So, what kind of happens when you have two groups on opposite ends of the spectrum that have to agree upon something? Well, you kind of get something in the muddy middle. The First Continental Congress adjourns by agreeing to adopt non-importation agreements. Now, remember that during the Stamp Act, these non-importation agreements were pretty effective. In fact, British imports to the colonies dropped 97% in 1775. And there is a promise that if the coercive acts aren't repealed, then not only would imports from Britain cease, but also exports from Britain cease. But you get the impression that even though this all started because of debt, at least from the perspective of the British government, for the British, it's now a matter of principle to a certain extent. So, what happens is the First Continental Congress adjourns without like any decisive resolution, except to kind of wait and see what happens. There are committees of observation and inspection that are formed to kind of wait and see what happens. But other than that, there's not much that gets decided in the First Continental Congress. So let's talk about the Battle of Lexington and Concord. And you're like, especially you, 3 a.m., who's just waking up, Mr. Dry, where did this come from? Well, sometimes wars are premeditated and planned affairs, and sometimes they just come out of the blue and smack you in the head, and you're blindsided by it. The American Revolution is one of those wars, and what you're going to hear is that very few people, if any, who attended the Battle of Lexington and Concord, not Concord, by the way, not the sleepy little town about, if you're in Albemarle, about 30 minutes away. No, if you're in New England, it's Concord. You have to put your nose into it. But anyway, very few people who attended those battles actually thought that they were, one, going to be doing any shooting that day, and two, thought that their actions would lead to not just a war, but kind of a global war eventually. Nobody really thought about that. And sometimes wars just happen. They spiral out of control, despite, in some cases, the best intentions of the individuals involved. So, the reason that the war happens the way it does is because of the Suffolk Resolves. Remember that because of the Suffolk Resolves, colonial militias, particularly in Massachusetts, were given instructions and encouragement to arm. And this made British Royal Governor Thomas Gage up here particularly nervous. Remember, he's the guy on the ground who's charged with suppressing this rebellion. And the fact that you have militia groups who are stockpiling weapons and ammunition is a pretty good sign that, things are not really going according to plan. So the question is, how do you diffuse the situation, without getting a lot of people shot? So it's at this point that Gage has an absolutely brilliant idea. Hey guys, so I have this brilliant idea, and it goes something like this. We'll sneak across the countryside in the middle of the night, and then we'll take their guns while they're asleep. This maybe goes a long way to explain why Americans act dispassionately and rationally anytime somebody says, we're going to take so-and-so's guns. So what happens is that Gage orders a small force of British troops to basically leave Boston and try to seize either leaders of the Sons of Liberty and or munitions and guns used to support them, whichever comes first, preferably both, right? But you'll notice that Boston is out this way, and it's a bit of a hike to get to Concord. So obviously, the other problem is that a lot of Boston was filled with a fair number of loyalists and Tories, but beyond the city of Boston, the British really had no control whatsoever. Gage's army in Boston was still, comparatively small, and certainly Gage's army wasn't large enough to act as any kind of police force. So what happens is that when the British Army leaves Boston, they're quickly snitched upon by members of the Sons of Liberty, most notably Paul Revere, but also other individuals who spread word that British regulars are marching towards Concord to seize weapons owned by the militia. So at this point, it should come as no surprise that by the time British troops actually make it to Concord, specifically on the North Bridge right outside of Concord, there's a large force of Massachusetts militia there in battle lines waiting for them. And the two forces wait. They stare each other down. They are deployed in battle lines with muskets leveled. The two commanding officers bark orders and threats at one another, telling each other to give way, but nobody does anything. And obviously, the Battle of Concord is known as the battle where you have the shot heard round the world, the shot that kind of inaugurates the American Revolution. But nobody talks about the standoff that happens right beforehand, which I think is in some ways a little bit more interesting. The British probably think that this force of Massachusetts militia has got to be bluffed at. I mean, we're the British Army. We're one of the best trained armies on earth. We have the largest navy at our backs, and these provincials are subjects of the king. Who are they to stand against him? Surely they're going to see good sense and disperse. And from the perspective of the militia, they're thinking, sure, we have disagreements with Parliament, with the British government, but even though we're not exactly BFFs with the Redcoats, we are still British subjects, as are they. And yes, during the English Civil War, British subjects shot at each other, but that was a more barbaric time when there was no consensus on our shared values. And at least now, there is some consensus that representative government is something that's valuable, that that individuals do have some basic rights under British constitutional law. And yes, we disagree vociferously with the idea of taxation without representation, but surely that's not worth getting anybody killed over. And so the two sides stared at each other. But the thing is that when you have lots of people in a confined space who are probably exhausted from, being drug out in the middle of the night, it doesn't take a genius to realize what might happen. And so at some point during this standoff, a shot is fired. And in some respects, it's basically the Boston Massacre all over again, where nobody really gives the order to fire. Just somebody gets nervous, and it happens. But when it does actually happen, both sides start discharging their muskets, start firing. And the thing is that the British are at a disadvantage because they're suddenly by firing this musket volley, they position themselves in the middle of hostile territory, because not only do the British have to worry about the militia group in front of them, they have to worry about dozens of other militia bands that are quickly approaching and threaten to surround them. And so what actually happens is that it's almost as if the British stir up a hornet's nest where hundreds and then thousands of militiamen start rallying around and start taking pot shots at the British Army. And so what happens is that what was going to be a stealthy operation to quietly take steps to suppress a rebellion ends up creating the very rebellion that the British were so interested in suppressing. And so the British Army finds itself fighting for its very life as it retreats all the way back to Boston. Now, if that's not interesting enough, what also happens is that not only is this small British detachment suddenly under threat, but the entire British presence in Boston is threatened, because suddenly, just within the course of a few days, in what has to be one of those America moments, suddenly there's 7,000 to 16,000 Massachusetts militiamen that surround the city of Boston. And so Boston, the most significant British military stronghold at this time, is suddenly under siege by an army with no country, with no commander and with no ideology, but a frustration with British policy. It's one of those improbable, bizarre occurrences. The British don't know what to do, nor do the delegates at the First Continental Congress. Because what's happened is that now there's a war. There's a war in Massachusetts, right? But now these delegates who supposedly speak for their colonies have to figure out how to respond to this. Because what might happen is that the country is looking like it's going to war with or without the Continental Congress. And that's what we'll pick up on next time.